Okay, and so we're gonna move on to our next speaker of the day. That's Tom Kaye. So Tom, feel free to share your slides. And yes, so Dr. Tom Kaye, he's the founder and executive director of the Institute for Applied Ecology. Tom serves on the board of directors of the Society for Ecological Restoration, and he is a courtesy associate professor in the botany and plant pathology department at OSU, Oregon State University. Tom has been leading research on rare species reintroductions, habitat restoration, and plant invasions at IAE for over 20 years. And we're excited to have him today talk about climate change and how it's affecting native plants and habitat restoration. So
Thanks very much, Alexis, and good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can I get a kind of confirmation? Thank you. Good. Well, welcome, everybody. Today, I'm going to talk about coping with climate change and some of the evidence, very recent research that's been done on how plants are responding or being impacted by climate change in the Pacific Northwest. So that's going to be my focus, but the implications are broad here across many parts of the country or the world. I'm going to start here with a welcome to the Anthropocene. This is a changed climate, a changed world. We have put so much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that we have changed the temperature and other conditions at the Earth's surface where we live and where everything else lives. So things are changing, and it's something we are grappling with, coping with. And as many of us have seen these graphs, right? Temperatures appear to be increasing, and they actually have increased already over the last century, but they're projected to increase and increase much more. When we talk about precipitation increases, that's a little, or changes, that's a little more uncertain. The ensemble models, even those that are most appropriate for the Pacific Northwest, suggest that it's either going to get wetter or drier or about the same, which is kind of a fancy way of saying, I don't know. So all bets are really off there around precipitation, except that as it gets warmer, plants experience essentially a drier environment, even if the rainfall stays the same, because of increased evapotranspiration. So in terms of the plant's experience to the world, it's likely to get drier as well as hotter. And there's a map here on the right with a little blue dot on it for about where I am today in Corvallis, Oregon. And what this map really illustrates is that the amount of temperature change that we expect to see across the landscape isn't the same everywhere. There are differences, gradients across the whole continent, across the globe, that suggest that where you are will determine how much climate change you really experience in terms of temperature. Of course, there are other impacts too, more catastrophic events, et cetera, that many of us, no matter where we are, may not be immune to. So I'm going to do a quick audience poll here, and I'm hoping Alexis can start this. And the question is the impact of and the pace of climate change happening at a rate kind of what you expected, or slower or faster? We've all been hearing the news. So how is it? What's your experience here? This is something I'm very interested in. It's what you're all experiencing, and I'm watching the results come in live here, and we'll cut this off in a few seconds. So please get your response in there if you have one. So I think we're probably reaching a plateau here. So Alexis, if you want to share the results, thank you. Many folks are experiencing climate change to be about what they expected. Some think it's slower, and some feel it's faster. In fact, the majority of us, it looks like, feel that the climate change is faster than expected. And I'll say that I too am in that group. I guess maybe I'm an optimistic person and was hoping it wasn't going to happen quite as fast as it appears to be. So that's something I want to touch on here. And so I'm going to, Alexis, can we stop sharing the poll and resume? Let's see. I'm going to try to do that. So I'm in trouble with the next slide here. Here we go. So as the climate changes, and we all experience and see things changing around us in a way that might be faster or more catastrophic than we expected, it takes a toll on us emotionally, psychically, psychologically. This is hard. This is daily trauma. It's chronic. And there really is a name for this that's been coined, and it's solastalgia. So, and that it's really referring to how we use nature as places of solace. And as these changes happen in the world, we lose those places of solace, and that is hard for us. And it's an emotional and personal effect. And I think it's okay for us to acknowledge that that's happening and consider that even while this is happening, we need to keep our heads and our wits about us and think about what we want to do in response. So that was heavy, but let's keep moving. So I'm going to talk for the rest of today's talk about some of the effects of climate change on plants with a Pacific Northwest focus. And then I'm also going to talk at the end about what we do about it in terms of plant selections and restoration. So some of the effects of climate change I'll review are the loss of biological diversity, plant diversity in particular, the changes in phenology that plants are already showing, range shifts that are happening, species extinctions, and the complex interactions between population biology and climate change and climate and land use. So diversity is in decline of climate change. And I'm going to give you a snapshot of a study that was done by a few people a few years ago. And what they did was they went back to some plots that had been established in the 1950s by a guy named Robert Whitaker, who was a renowned plant ecologist at the time. And he put in these plots in the Siskiyou Mountains in Southern Oregon and Northern California. And these folks returned to those plots and resampled them. And what they found was in the intervening time from 1950 to 2007, more than half of the plant diversity had been lost from these plots, regardless of the substrate. There's some very interesting different edaphic or rock type environments down there, but that was not really in effect. It was just time since then. And they attributed this in large part to climate change. Now, plants are also shifting in their phenology in the Pacific Northwest. And here's a recap of a study recently published where folks went back to herbarium specimens and looked at the phenology, the flowering time on herbarium specimens over a greater than 100-year period. And what they found was that the season at which plants bloom and have important phenological events was earlier, especially in low elevation and coastal areas. And it was also earlier in arid and higher elevation areas, but not to the same degree. So it was a stronger effect at low elevation and maritime sites. And so what this means is that, yes, plants are responding phenologically, but it's not the same everywhere. And we don't necessarily know why, but this is, again, climate's not changing the same everywhere, and plants are not responding the same everywhere. So early bloomers are shifting earlier, especially at low elevations, and late bloomers are shifting less. So plants that are blooming later in the season are not as impacted. So again, complex effects on phenology. Overall, there's about a 4.4 day shift per 1 degree of centigrade in warming. So ranges also may need to shift with climate change. So we're getting into some of this stuff about what happens when climates change. And this is a really interesting study, probably one of the most important studies in our region to look at the impacts of climate change on plants, because what these people did was put out plots across a gradient from Southern Oregon into Washington, and they manipulated temperature and precipitation so we could understand both what's going on today and how things are likely to respond as climates change. And we can sort of jumpstart that climate effect by looking at how will these plants respond to a changed climate. So these are folks down at University of Oregon and their collaborators elsewhere. So they looked at several plants in these communities that they planted and then manipulated. And what some of the things they found, in very brief, was that the plants on the left were plants that occurred throughout the area. And so when they planted them in there, they also occurred locally. These were within their range. All of their test sites had these plants nearby, and these were a fescue, a sunflower species, and a Danthonia oatgrass. And what they found with these species was that when they heated them and provided drought, similar to what they might experience with climate change, they declined. All of these species declined. So this is some stark information that shows us these native plants in their native range are likely to be impacted by climate change, and in fact already are declining because of climate change. And then also there were a couple of other species that didn't occur throughout the sites naturally, but then when they planted them into the northern sites and then heated them as though they were experiencing climate change, those plants actually did better than if they weren't heated. So this suggests that these plants and others can be moved northward and will start experiencing environments that will favor their population growth rates. So climate change is happening. It's already affecting these species. And when we manipulate some of the environments to see how will they respond to a future climate, we find that it's either negative within their current range or positive further north, in this case, in the northern hemisphere. So here's another fairly recent study about trees, and these folks looked at thousands and thousands of plots from throughout the Pacific Northwest, California, Oregon, and Washington. And what they found was that at the low end of this graph, you can see that seedlings are actually dying and not persisting as well as the adults. So adult trees are persisting in some of these species, especially in the south, latitudinally in the south, and but they're not reproducing and making babies. So these are kind of ghost populations. They're standing there. They're the living dead, so to speak. The climate has changed out from under them so that they can no longer reproduce. So this is about 33 species that are affected this way. So trees are being impacted, and the climate has changed out from under them. And we need to be really looking at how do we help some of these tree species in the future. We may need to be helping them move, perhaps. And we'll get into that conversation here in a minute. Population extinctions are clearly being driven by climate change. And this is a study that we have been involved with at the Institute for Applied Ecology. It was published a couple of years ago with a species called Cypripedium fasciculatum, the clustered lady slipper. And what we found by going back to populations that had been located in the past and revisiting them, just like those folks did with Robert Whitaker's study, is by revisiting them, we were able to understand better what the extinction rates of populations of this species are. And what we found was that there are a number of factors that can affect extinction and help us predict extinction. One of them is population size. Bigger populations are less likely to go extinct through time. And also time. As time goes by, the risk of going extinct goes up. But the other factor is potentially related to climate, and that's elevation. The lower elevation populations were more likely to go extinct. So as we go up in elevation, populations are less likely to go extinct. So what that means is there's a kind of a range trimming going on in this species. Some of its range is being cleaved off, and we're not seeing, or we're not really sure about new populations and the establishment of new population rates at higher elevations, but at least the lower populations are declining. And then when we map the total known populations in this region in Southern Oregon and Northern California, where we did the study, and ask what's the likelihood those populations are still there, about half of those populations are probably gone already because of either their size, their time since anyone observed them, or their elevation. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the complexity that happens when we're trying to really understand what's going on with a plant's life cycle and interaction with climate change or weather variables in general. So this is with a species called Green's Mariposa lily, the Calochortus greenii. And it's a plant that occurs in southern Oregon and can be in areas that are grazed by cattle. And what we did was we put out plots and sampled populations demographically over time, over a decade. And some of those were fenced and some of those were not. So we could look at the effects of animal usage of their populations versus climate change. But here's the complex part is you can break the population processes down into some different processes, different events. There's survival, there's growth, there's reproduction, and in this case, there's dormancy. Thanks for the warning. And you can also, all of those things sum together equal population growth. And then when we look at the seasons, we can look at those as climate, and there's a bunch of climate variables. And there's like maximum temperature, minimum temperature, precipitation, et cetera, that occur within these seasons. And we can see that summer conditions affect reproduction of this species, but fall conditions affect growth. And spring conditions affect dormancy. And fall conditions also affect dormancy. And spring conditions also affect survival. And there are different climate variables that are affecting different parts of the life cycle. The top driver of population growth in this species was the minimum temperature in spring, but it's complicated, right? There's really a net effect of all these different climate differences and how those affect population growth rate. So keep that in mind when we talk about is climate change good or bad for a plant? It's the net result of a lot of different things going on at once. And then when we overlay cows onto this is sort of kind of mucks up the work. So what we found here was that on the left is in a landscape that's a working landscape with cattle on it. Conditions are, regardless of climate change, suggest that the populations are likely to decline over the next century. But if we remove cattle from the equation, the populations are likely to increase. In fact, there's a suggestion that climate change could even improve conditions for this species over time, but only if cattle are removed from the system. So that's enough about how plants are responding to climate change, although it's a big topic and we could go on and on. But I want to talk now for the rest of my time about sourcing plants for habitat restoration in a changing climate. And we can talk about local adaptation, but also future climate analogs and the topic of assisted migration. So, and this is a buzzword. And so I'm going to pull up a poll here. Thank you, Alexis. And if you'd be willing to share your sense of your comfort with the topic of, or the action of assisted migration, that would be great. We'll see where people stand on this. And the results are flowing in here. We got about 100 people so far have responded. We'll give you just a few more moments to fill this out. And, you know, if you're not comfortable sharing this information, that's okay. And this is all, all anonymous. All right, I think we're plateauing now. So the results are here. A few people are very uncomfortable. Some are somewhat uncomfortable. A fair number are neutral, and there's somewhat comfortable and very comfortable. So we have actually a fairly even range in here. In a conversation we started in the Whova community groups, one of the questions was, does it make you uncomfortable? And someone wrote in, thank you for this, that it makes them feel queasy. And I share that queasiness. And I also look at it as we may not have much choice, but let's talk some more about that here. So why does all this matter? I'm sorry, I'm got trouble here. Okay, so here's another study about local adaptation. So one of the things that's very important to know about when you're selecting your plant materials is, do you need to use the local type because of local adaptation, that plants are selected to grow best in the area they're from? And so in this study was a analysis of many, many different common garden studies. And what we found was that 95% of 305 studies we looked at showed that there was variation among populations. That is the norm. That is the grist for the mill of natural selection. We also found that that variation was associated with environmental variables 86% of the time. And 75% of the time, those were climate variables. So plants vary across the landscape, and 75% of the time, that's driven by climate. So that's a very strong signal for climate adaptation. And then for those populations or those studies, fewer that we could look at this way, there was a local advantage for survival and flowering 67 and 90% of the time. So yeah, local is best usually because of local adaptation and evolution, but the climate's changing. And so some of these results are from studies that are decades old, and we're not sure if those would hold still now. So planning for climate change is maybe something we need to be doing. So how do we select our plant materials? Well, first off, we see that if this is from a study by Kay Havens and others, this panel on the right, that if you look at where the climates of plants are going in the future, in the eastern half of the state, they're primarily moving northward in the United States. So primarily moving northward. That's where climates are going. But if you go to the west, they're going every which way. And that is probably because we have so much more topographic complexity here. Because when you talk about climate moving, it's not just moving poleward, but it's moving uphill, up into the mountains, or at least up in elevation. So it gets a little more complicated. So Breed and others have thrown out that there are some strategies for obtaining seeds. You know, there's keeping things strictly local. There's making kind of a relaxed or mixed local. There's a composite mix within a general region. There's an admixture, which is range-wide mix. And then there's predictive matching. And we'll talk about the composite mix and predictive here right now. So in the Willamette Valley, Native Plant Partnership, our approach is to sample populations from many different populations inside this ecoregion, the Willamette Valley ecoregion. And I keep in mind, this is a relatively small level 3 ecoregion as ecoregions go. And then we collect from many sites, and then we put them all together in one field. And that gives us a high amount of genetic diversity, so that when we put the seeds onto a site, that site has a lot of different diversity or genotypes from which to select which will grow best, because it's very difficult to match any particular source to any particular site. This gives us a high degree of diversity, and the plants have actually gone through some interbreeding in the population, so the resulting seeds are a mix of lots of different genotypes, but from within a fairly limited area. This is sort of a 30 by 90 mile wide area. And so this is an example with Iris 10X. And you can see in the upper left here, the composite mix is, there's sort of a leveraging both local adaptation and genetic diversity. We're in this area between those two circles where we're getting some local adaptation and a lot of genetic diversity. Now I'm gonna, we already did this poll, so I'm not really sure what's up there. I think it must have been in twice. Sorry about that. So now I'm going to talk about a tool, an online tool that allows you to plan for doing a predictive approach. And I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit long, but I'm not going to use up too much time. We're almost done. And the idea here is you can put into this program where you are now and ask, where is my climate of tomorrow today? So I can go collect there and bring materials to my site that will be locally adapted to tomorrow's climate. And so we've actually used this tool to help some planning for riparian restoration in the Portland area with some of our partners at Clean Water Services and Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District to just ask the question, first, where on the landscape could we collect to increase the climate resiliency of the plantings in the future? And yeah, this is a form of considering assisted migration. And what we're talking about is putting up, thank you, is putting up a assisted migration trials where we can grow some of these plants from different areas. These are really adjacent ecoregions. We're not talking very far flung, but adjacent ecoregions to see how well they do and how they differ. So this is a way to start getting informed and doing the research. And so I'm going to close here with saying, let's think though a little bit beyond assisted migration. And I'm talking about the term adaptive sourcing. And so this means, yeah, like we talked about before, within a region, collecting widely so you have both local adaptation and maximized genetic diversity. And when we talk about maximizing diversity, collecting from sites that are both harsh locations within our local area and during bad years. Sometimes we think we shouldn't collect during the bad years because, you know, the plants aren't making much seeds. That's just the time we should collect. We may need to be soft in our collection so we don't overdo it, but we need the genotypes of individuals that can still flower and set seed during those extreme years. We need to include those in our collections. And then when it comes to assisted migration or climate matching, we need to consider collecting from the adjacent future climate analog locations and importing those needed genes. And I'm talking about within a species at this point, but there may be points where we need to bring in species from some adjacent but hot area. And I don't mean necessarily only going to some far-flung part of geography. It might just be a hotter place nearby. So when we talk about assisted migration, a lot of us kind of get nervous about moving plants from a long way away, and we don't necessarily need to do that. We need to think it through, and it's going to be highly case by case, but we need a decision tree to work this out with so that we're not paralyzed by fear and we're not taking undue risks. So that's where I'm going to close today. And I want to thank you all for listening to my diatribe about climate change and how we should be modifying how we get our sources. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was a great presentation. We are going to be pulling questions from the Q&A box, and I think we have about time for one question maybe. So I'm going to go for the top question that has been liked, and it is the loss of diversity at certain layers like understory, or is it in all layers?
Great question. I think the loss of diversity is more in the ground cover level in at least in the Pacific Northwest than from canopy. We don't have huge tree diversity in the Pacific Northwest to start with. And although we do face some risks to some of those trees, especially locally, Douglas firs sometimes have die-out periods in the Willamette Valley because of climate change. And the ash trees face eradication from the emerald ash border if that arrives here, and it looks like it will sometime soon. So trees face risks, but the understory, the ground level, is where the real action is for biological diversity driven by plants.
Great, thank you so much. I think that is all the time we have for live questions right now, but
I'm happy to go to the question box and type some answers in there too.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then I'll give it over to Alexis. Thank you again, Tom.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. There's been good discussion in the chat as well as quite a few questions to follow up on. So thank you.